Hi guys, we're going to do something really interesting today because of technical difficulties. So what I'm going to do is talk about what I built. So I want to tell you guys a story about the problem that I had and how I solved it. And then I am going to hide behind there and actually show you because we couldn't bring my laptop out here. So this is going to be really interesting, so please bear with me today. And I'm also going to keep saying slides so they can change the slides as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is some fun I had with Docker volumes. Next, please. Slides. Oh, there we go. So the problem, you can just go ahead to the next slide. That'll probably be the easiest. So the problem that I had with Docker was with are you guys familiar with Docker? Awesome. Do any of you use it in production? Okay, awesome. So you guys are probably familiar with this as well. So Docker has volumes. So if you spin up a container and store data inside the container, you can actually click the next slide, and store data inside the container. What happens is when the container goes away, next slide, please, everything's gone. So the data that you had and all the information inside the container is away. That's the whole purpose of a container. Next slide. So what Docker actually implemented was volume. So what we can do is we can say, okay, this file or this directory on this host maps to a location inside the container. So when the container goes away, the data is persisted. Next slide. But the problem there is that next slide. This is really difficult. The problem there is that when the entire server goes away, your data's gone still as well. So I was investigating ways to figure out, okay, how can we do backups? Next slide. So with the backups, we want to be able to have our data somewhere and send it somewhere else. That way, because data is very sensitive, and we treat it as a very sensitive thing. Next slide. So I looked at Docker. First, went to their docs. Obviously, the first thing that any developer would do. And if you can read that, it's very small. I'm sorry. What they recommend you do is basically use like an intermediate container to spin it up, basically take your volume and tar it up, and then you can just do whatever you want with the tar. This didn't really float my boat. Next slide. So I kind of came up with some expectations around this. So one of the expectations I had is that it be automatic. I don't want to have to spin up the container and manually back up everything anytime that I want to do the backups. I wanted to restore it easily when shit happens, because that's probably the most important part of having a backup, and then also have multiple copies of it. So then I looked, okay, what typically has these problems? Databases, right? They probably have solved this. So I went straight to Mongo, probably the most familiar database that I know, and they really gave you two main methods. The first one was just copying the files, so using file system snapshots. So if you guys are familiar with Amazon, so take like the EC2, EBS and just snapshot it, save that somewhere, straight up copy them, or use rsync, which is a synchronization tool. But the problem with these is that if you actually do this while the database is running, you'll probably get corrupted data and then stuff goes bad. And so the second way was MongoDump, which actually solves that, because it would just store the documents instead of the entire directory or the file system. And then you can basically take the dump and then save that somewhere else. But we still go back to the original problem to where it's not automated, not very easy when shit goes down, and then also I don't have multiple copies of it. Next slide. So when I was actually in Verona for JS Day, I met Matthias, and Matthias told me about Dat. Dat is a project. Dat has an awesome name. I really was waiting to say that. But the definition of it on the website is it's a version control decentralized data sync tool for collaboration between data people and data systems. I was like, that sounds very similar to the problem I'm trying to solve. So I was like, okay, why not give it a try? So I looked it up and it looked to be perfect. Next slide, please. And with it, I actually got a new expectations to add as well. That is actually, because it helps you manage your data between multiple places, it's version controlled as well. I was like, it'd be nice to have my backups be version controlled too. So I just do that on the end of it. Next slide. So what we're able to do with that is we're able to have that host per se, and our data persisted to the host, and then use that to stream it somewhere else automatically and continuously do it on a certain interval, whatever you set. So that way, not only do we have a backup of our data, but it's also in a data repository that we can pull, we can send somewhere else, we can have multiple copies of it. So basically, it started to meet all my expectations, and I said, okay, this might be a good idea. Next slide. Multiple copies. Next slide. So I'm going to actually save the demo to the next slide. I'm going to demo everything at once instead of going back and forth. So once I got that to work, the next thing I thought was that, okay, while the replication is happening, wouldn't it be cool if I just ran a container on the replication and just had two containers running off of the same replicated values and that? And I was able to do so. So next slide, please. So what I was envisioning in my brain was kind of an architecture like this. So I have one slide that's basically like reading and writing. So that's the slide that actually has the data, container that actually has the data. And that's replicating to another one that only just needs to read. Depending on how you architect this may not work, but for my special case, it did. And that it just needed the reads. And then I can have Nginx just send requests to both of them. But then I thought of a more interesting solution that probably would apply to more people was just that if the read-write one was my actual production, and if that shit were to blow up, just go to the next one. That's just read and doesn't really have to write. Nginx gives us a cool ability to do so because I can just have a very simple Nginx file like this and just say one is a backup, and I was done. I thought I had to do way more work to get that to work. Next slide, please. So then we get something like this. So my request will always go to the container that's reading and writing, and then if things were to happen, then I would just, all the requests using Nginx would just go to the read-only container, which is very good for a temporary solution. That's just my application is not down. At least they get to read something. So next slide, please. Now I get to go back. Hello? All right, let's see how this is gonna work. Can I not hold them? Okay. Thank you, appreciate that. So, everything is not the way I had it. That is awesome. So I can start off by showing you guys this tool. I want to see how big that I'm working with. There we go. So I created a tool. It's basically a storage tool. It's pretty cool because all it did was create files using dev.no of just any different sizes. So if I start up the tool, what we'll be able to see here is if you look to the left of the screen, eventually files will start to be created. And I just have it going every 5 seconds. So it's just going to continuously create files. So this was how I actually tested the replication of the volume. So I'm going to stop that and delete these files because that's going to cause problems if I don't. And I actually have that in Docker. What's pretty cool is that, I'm sorry, everything got mixed up. No. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I just put that simple Node app in Docker with this very simple Docker file pulling from the IO.js image. And then what I was able to do is just say, okay, map the volume on my Mac to the storage volume, which is inside the container. So that way I can run this same application in the container and it generate, on my machine. And because I knew I would have internet problems, I'm going to simulate 2 containers running 2 different machines. It's just 2 containers running on my machine using 2 different folders. And that's what we see here to the left, the storage and the slave. So the next piece that I had to solve was, I called the tool sync. And with sync, it's actually pretty simple because what I was able to do is pretty much say, every 5 seconds, tar up the volume directory, which is that storage directory that our application is writing to, and then pipe that into dat. And I save it as a key of volume.tar. I know it's a very creative name, and use the dataset files. So this is basically saying, hey, zip up my entire volume and send it to dat. And then from the slave point of view, what I was able to do, it says, okay, I need you to not only replicate yourself first, but then take the tar, then unstream it, and then take the tar, then untar it, and place that in a directory. So now we're going to test this out, and I hope it works. So I'm going to start the first application. I have it under a start script. And we can see that going if we see files start to pop up here. Okay, awesome. And then now I'm going to start the push version of sync that's actually going to start to, wait, just want to make sure I do that. So this is actually going to start backing up the tar into that. And I want to start So now what we should be able to see is here, if we're looking in this directory, here's my volume tar. So if I untar it now, we'll see that we have a bunch of files in here. And then if I wait like 5 seconds and then untar it again, we'll be able to see that there's more. So you can see that now that, okay, we're successfully testing it, and then that is managing all of the files in that tar. So because it's been running for a second, I'm going to actually just delete some of these just to make it work a little bit better. So now I'm actually going to start the slave, so the sync slave, which will take care of the rest. So now what you'll see is hopefully over here that as we create files with our tool and it's syncing from one volume, they're popping up in the next volume. And to test this even more, there are two applications that one application that just basically shows the files on the screen. So I'm going to run those, and hopefully that they work as well. So if we go here are both of the apps. They're basically just listing the files in a directory, and they're actually using socket.io to list it. And if we can see that now, oh, demos are hard. Yeah, it's not. Want to refresh. I have no idea why. But if we look at the directories here, and as I delete files and change them, we can see that they're being synced between both of the volumes, which both of the applications using these volumes will treat them as if, they were live data. So now I'm going to come back over there. Uh-oh. Is it on? Okay. So what I was able to do was build Sync, which is a very, very simple tool right now that I'm going to continue to build out. And eventually, like halfway during my presentation, Docker plugins were released. I was like, oh, this is going to make my presentation really difficult. So I wasn't able to get it as a Docker plugin today, but that's the next step of it. But essentially what I was able to do is build a tool that continuously backs up my volume, and that eventually I can run another Docker container on the backup of that volume, which I probably won't do in production. There are a couple caveats. So for really, 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 really big files, because I created a gig file, something didn't happen, but I'm probably sure that's just because of the intervals that I was working with. If I set them longer, then it would take longer to actually replicate. But there are things I have to play with, and it definitely works. And I appreciate you guys listening to me and working with me on this. Thank you. Yes.
Briefly how, let's say something really horrible happens to the master database, like how does the version control, like the versioning work where you can kind of like restore that back to the master, for example? Is that a workflow that you explore?
Yeah, so the nice thing about that is it took care of all the hard pieces for me, really, to be honest. So when you have one DAT repository and I pull it in another place, I can actually use that to serve up as another repository. So one cool thing that I will be able to do is so the sync master is running on the same machine as your master database. So if that goes down, we go back to our original problem. But what sync will be able to do is hopefully is once the master goes down, the slave will recognize that, hey, I can't pull from you anymore, and then it becomes the master. And then all of the other syncs will now use that as a master. So I can implement some sort of priority and then use like etcd to have like a service discovery layer on top of it. So that will be the plan for that. But most of the replication in terms of repository is handled on that layer. So that's exactly why I built it on top of that. Any other questions? Awesome. Thanks, guys.